Welcome to another episode of Savor Food and Body. Today I'm talking with Dr. Erin Hayford, a naturopathic doctor and somatic experiencing practitioner, and more recently, an intuitive eating counselor in training. As a mind-body specialist, Dr. Erin is very interested in all the ways we are attuned or not attuned to our bodies and how this impacts overall well-being. She specializes in the emotional causes of physical illness, a common but often overlooked cause of many health conditions. Dr. Erin also enjoys being outside in the mountains, reading and hanging out with her family. The fact that she loves the mountains, honestly, like this is why Dr. Erin's on the podcast. As you all know, mountains and I are besties.
Love it.
So yes, I think we're going to be kindred colleagues from here on out. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Erin. And I'm really excited for us to dive into this more deeper connection between how we might be feeling into our bodies or why it might be difficult to feel into our bodies and how that can make intuitive eating difficult. And also how that, like what we're feeling in our emotions, how that can kind of disrupt what we're feeling in our guts too. I've just had, so we're talking before we push record, I've had a number of both clients and then listeners to the podcast too say, hey, I think my gut's a mess because of what I'm feeling. So what do I do about that? So I would love for us to unpack that a little bit more for folks today.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here to talk about this. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, so I'm excited to share it with everyone.
Yay. Well, I'm excited to learn from you for sure. So let's just start with stress. What does stress mean, generally speaking? And, how is our body responding to that in ways that we might not really recognize because we're kind of checked out because stress is hard?
Exactly. Yeah. So to me, this is an important starting place because we use that word a lot, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. So to me, generally speaking, stress is anything that causes the body to go beyond its capacity for basic regulation and coping. So that can be, mental, emotional stress. Like this situation is so stressful, I don't have coping skills to deal with it. That could certainly go into the realm of trauma. So sometimes we actually dissociate from the event if it's that stressful, or we go into fight or flight. So we can have different reactions to it on that level. It can also be physical. So a physical illness that is beyond the body's capacity to manage. That can be when chronic illness starts to show up. So it can show up on both the mental and emotional plane. So when we think about stress, it doesn't always have to be mental, emotional. It can be anything that pushes the body beyond its natural capacity to regulate and keep us in a basic, homeostatic place.
Mm-hmm. The one illness or condition that I'm really thinking about related to this is IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. I know I saw it a lot in myself as part of like my disordered eating recovery. I mean, I think part of some of those disordered eating behaviors started happening because I wasn't feeling well in my gut. And I see this a lot in my clients too. So, maybe if we just use that as an example of something that is more chronic that people are feeling, and it's also a condition that kind of gets passed off a lot of times by the medical community. Like,
absolutely.
Share more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, IBS is one of those frustrating diagnoses that's like, yes, there's something wrong with you, but we don't really know why. So this is your diagnosis. And it's really common. And it's interesting. I was just talking to a patient actually earlier this morning about this idea of medical trauma, which I think can come from something like a diagnosis like IBS, which is essentially like, you're sick, we don't know why, so sorry, like this is just kind of your new label. And that can really start to, kind of like you're speaking to, it can lead to these other issues or concerns or feeling like there's something wrong with us. And that can really snowball for a person. It can, this person I was talking to this morning was saying, I was previously very healthy, nothing wrong with me. And then I get this diagnosis. Suddenly I'm taking these medications, I'm having these chronic symptoms. I don't know what to do about it or how to feel better. And no one's really giving me a lot of like input or advice on what to do about that. So it can start to feed into this idea of, yeah, I'm sick, I'm not well, my body's not functioning, it's not doing what I want it to do. So in that alone, I think IBS has both the physical stressors and the mental emotional stressors just sort of all balled up into one. So there's the mental stress of, I don't know how to get better. I don't know what this is. I don't know what I'm doing or not doing to feel better. And then also the physical stress of just having those chronic symptoms that are unrelenting and relapsing. So it's definitely a combination of the two.
Yeah, maybe as we dive into a little bit more detail for folks too, what is this idea of neuroception and maybe how that relates to, let's say, the physiological impact of stress on the gut, how that
Totally
might present as IBS?
Absolutely, yeah. So for those who are familiar with Stephen Porges, he's this guy who I guess created or came up with the polyvagal theory. So this is a term that he also coined. So neuroception is basically this idea that our minds are, as we all know, capable of what I call time travel. We can think about the future, we can go to the past, we can be anywhere but here now. We're good at that. We're pretty well adapted to that. But our bodies are always here. Our bodies are always present. They're always taking in the environment. They're always sensing into what's around us. They're feeling if this is safe or not safe. We are at our core, we are still animals. We have an animal part of our brain that's sort of wired for survival. And so that's that neuroception part of us that's constantly surveying the environment, looking for safety, looking for not safety, and then responding accordingly. So if there's something in our environment that doesn't feel safe, our mind may or may not get the sort of cues on that, but our body is certainly responding to it. So there can be, activation in the nervous system, which would be muscle tightening, increased heart rate, dilating of the pupils, sweat starts to, you can start sweating, like sweaty palms is common. So that's that kind of immediate response that can happen when something activates us or doesn't feel safe. If this is a chronic situation, then there's this chronic activation going on in the system. And that's where it can become, that's where these chronic symptoms or chronic illnesses can start to come from, because there's this constant activation in the nervous system saying, hey, something doesn't feel safe, something is off. Because our minds are capable of overriding that or ignoring that or going into the future or going into the past, kind of like avoiding the present situation, that chronic activation has to go somewhere else, or that, it starts to create physical symptoms. And I think of that as a way of like the body being like, hey, pay attention to me. I'm trying to tell you that this doesn't feel safe, whether it's a person or a job or some actual physical symptom that we're ignoring. So it can be a lot of different things, but again, our brains can be really good at overriding that. So that's where that constant activation in the nervous system can start to create physical symptoms.
I've not heard it explained that right way. And I really love how you explained, like, our minds can do the time traveling, but our bodies can't. Mm-hmm. I think, like, just when you said, I'm like, oh, I think that's going to land with a lot of people, because it's speaking to the same thing of that disassociation. Mm-hmm. But that can feel a little technical sometimes, but I think it really makes sense. Like, that people understand what it means to future trip or think about what is the future, the what ifs. Yep. And also, but thinking about the past, like, but then when this happened to me, like X, Y, and Z. So I love that, just that idea of the mind time traveling, whereas like from the neck down, it's like, nope, hello, I'm here. Yeah. I know what you had for breakfast. I know if you didn't have breakfast, like, that's all it has to do with. So, I really love that, that description. I think that's so helpful in so many ways. And so now if we go back to, say IBS, and I know you have your own personal story with another inflammatory bowel disease with Crohn's, how might, say, someone in your experience, both professionally and personally, now then look at those symptoms, those messages that are coming from the body, from the neck down, and look at them from a little bit different lens, like both how do we support the person feeling those, and how do we maybe even explain to someone who is feeling this GI distress, and trying to make sense of it with their brain, but it may not necessarily be a brain figure out problem.
Right, totally. Yeah. And I think this is where it can be tricky, because sometimes when you're saying, these symptoms or syndromes or chronic illnesses are, emotional suppression or trauma, or it can start to feel a little bit like blaming the person, like, well, it's your fault, you're suppressing your emotions, that's why you're sick. So I'm really careful in the way that I talk about this, because I think it's more, in my world, the way I try to talk to patients about it, it's more about empowerment, and kind of going back to that like chronic illness picture of like the person who, you know, has these chronic symptoms and they don't understand why, nothing is helping them. I think this can be a turning point for folks to say there actually is something you can do, and you can do it. Like, you can work on this. You just need to learn the tools and have, you know, maybe a guide or someone to help you along the way, but there is a way to feel better. Not all is not lost, right? So it's this sort of, I try to talk about it in this more empowering way, because again, it can feel like, oh, it's my fault, I'm sick. Great. You know, that's great news. So yes, in my own story with Crohn's, I went through the conventional medical system. It's actually how I discovered naturopathic medicine, because the conventional medicine helped some, but then I needed, you know, I felt like there had to be something else, right? I didn't want to just take pills. I was 21, I was in my early 20s. I didn't want to just take medications for the rest of my life. So I decided to look into alternative methods, other things I could do. So I started working with a naturopathic doctor, and that also helped some. So everything I did got me kind of further down the road, but it was just that feeling of there's something else, there's something I'm missing, there's some other piece here. And so I think of this work with mind body medicine, with somatic medicine, as a, you know, it's sort of not in place of physical treatments. I think it's important for folks to do that exploration, to get the tests done, to have, you know, a doctor make sure there's not something physically going on that can easily be, you know, corrected or whatever. But it's in complement to that. So sometimes I will say, you know, it can be fully physical. Sometimes it can be fully mental, emotional, but more often than not, I would say it's a blend of the two. And that was certainly the case for myself. So, you know, I did some of those physical modalities. I got some help from that, but that missing piece was this mind body somatic work. And when I really learned to start to move, like we were saying earlier, from the neck down into my body and learn how to be embodied and listen to what was going on below the neck, that's when I really started to have major shifts in my own health. And you know, my Crohn's is now considered in remission without medications or anything like that, which is not typically what, you know, they say a chronic illness like that is forever. You know, it's something you're going to have forever. So I think for me, it really, that spoke volumes to the importance of weaving this piece in to complement the physical work that a person is doing. So a person with IBS, I think it's just that important message of, you know, that it's not hopeless. Like, I know you've done this and that and the other thing, you've taken this medication, you've done this test, you've found these things, maybe it's helped a little bit. And for people who end up in my office, that's often the story of, I did all this therapy or I did all these medications, I still don't feel great, what's missing? And this is the piece that I think is important to recognize. It's the emotional piece, that traumatic or suppressed emotions, or just, it doesn't even have to be trauma. It can just be the ways in which we ignore our bodies in a subtle way on a daily basis. So to speak to the work you do, right? Like not listening to hunger cues, like pushing ourselves and not eating enough, not drinking enough water, not sleeping enough, not working jobs that bring us meaning and joy, not having relationships that bring us meaning and joy. Like that's all ignoring our bodies too. So it doesn't have to be, you know, childhood trauma or like, I have all this anger I'm suppressing. Sometimes, a lot of times it is stuff like that. Like it's big emotions that we're not allowing ourselves to feel, but I would say it can be those subtle ways in which we ignore ourselves throughout our daily lives that can also play a role.
I see this so much with my clients too, particularly women in midlife, because they have been caring for lots of other people, be that their own families or the roles that they've had in their jobs. They're fairly advanced in their careers now, and they've just been caring for and putting out everybody else's fires than theirs. So, yeah, you're right. Maybe there isn't something big and dramatic and scary, like big T, you know, big T trauma, you know, that's happened for them. But enough of these like micro traumas, of which also being told that their body is not okay, it needs to maintain a thin size, you know, all of that, dieting over all the years, like I look at that as small T trauma also. But now when we come into this 40s, maybe even late 30s, 40s, and 50s, and these major shifts are happening in our bodies, I think it almost forces women, and I'll raise my hand to this age group as well, that we better start listening to our bodies, because now they're kind of yelling at us in a way. But you're right, there can be a lot of shame, maybe misinformation, lack of support from medical, like how often someone might be told, especially around GI symptoms, like, well, it is in your head,
Right.
or it's just part of perimenopause, your hormones are fluctuating, like, deal, go get some probiotics, whatever.
Right.
And so just from what you were describing there is, I see this kind of bleed through this intersection, especially for women in midlife. There's a lot of stress going on in life, period. Life changes, things like that. Their body is changing in sometimes very dramatic ways, and they're trying to put this all together and feel better. And I think that that's a perfect time for this somatic experiencing education, medical support, all of that to come in. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to that, for like, if a woman is in this stage of life, how can this mind-body medicine become even more important and an important ally of maybe what they're already doing with their care team?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things one conversation I have with women in that age range most often is we are sort of sold as a society that menopause, perimenopause is going to be uncomfortable. You're going to suffer through it. It's just part of life. And my answer to that is always like, it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like, why do we have to suffer through that? And oftentimes, if someone is suffering through it, if their symptoms are really extreme, if they're having a lot of hot flashes and night sweats and stress and all that sort of thing, to me, that just speaks to the potentially the size of the emotional burden they're carrying, to look at that side of things. Certainly there can be, physical things going on for that woman, but oftentimes it's the stress that can be messing up the hormones, which can then make the transition more uncomfortable, because in our bodies, when we are, prioritizing, quote unquote, prioritizing stress, like if we are in a more stressed out state more often than not, our body is prioritizing making stress hormones and therefore sort of ignoring sex hormones, progesterone and estrogen. And it's going to cause those hormones to be more imbalanced, which is going to make that transition more uncomfortable. So I think of this, yes, like you were saying, mind-body medicine is important at all stages, and particularly in this stage, also because women are sometimes finding themselves as empty nesters in this place, and they are sort of forced to start to look at themselves again, which can either be great or it can be very distressing, depending on how disconnected you are from yourself at this point in life. I mean, to me, it's a skill that ideally we would all have, but culturally, because we're, trained to be in our heads all the time, we often don't have that skill. And, obviously the longer we go not having it, the harder it is to recapture. But I do think that this is a beautiful way to learn how to turn that lens back to yourself when your body is changing, there's symptoms coming up. Again, if kids are leaving the house, right, there's a transition happening. And so part of that transition could be tuning back into your body, coming back into a different relationship with yourself, and, spending the rest of your life in that kind of mode of like having more of a connection to yourself, having more attunement, more focus on yourself, because that's kind of the gift, right, of that transition period, is that you now get to be with yourself more in a way that you haven't before. And so again, rather than that being like a distressing, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be with me kind of thing, to me, I would say the more a person feels resistant to being with themselves, the more somatic work would be helpful for them, because that would be a question of, well, what is it about your body that's so uncomfortable that you don't want to be there? You don't want to spend time with yourself, and let's look at that and see how we can, improve that relationship, basically.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue into this next piece of like, okay, and how do we do this type thing? So, some basic strategies are helping people understand it, because so often, whether it's related to perimenopause, IBS, and both happening at the same time, oftentimes I hear they're given from their medical team, either, like you said, a bunch of supplements, bunch of medications, and or when it comes to food, like, we'll eliminate this food. It must be this problem, especially from the IBS place, but we're hearing it a lot in the perimenopause space also, like, oh, cut carbs, that'll support your blood sugar, and, all of this stuff too. So where could someone start with how to like bring more of that mind body medicine or some simple techniques or just like an introduction to it, to where they can kind of get this foundation of like, oh, I don't have to start eliminating all these foods. I don't have to start spending a boatload of money on supplements. Like, what could this look like for someone to start practicing mind body work?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, and I agree with all of what you're saying. Like, I don't necessarily feel like the more, we go through life, the more supplements we need to take, the more we need to eliminate. I think we're in a culture of sort of like taking things away the sicker we get. Like, let's take all these things out of your life that bring you joy in the spirit of making you feel better, which doesn't really make any sense. So to me, to use an example of someone I work with, a woman who is in that stage of life, she also has IBS, and we started with just actually basic principles of intuitive eating of, well, what do you, when you really tune into your body, what do you really want to eat? Like, if you gave yourself unconditional permission to eat, what would you actually eat? And she's someone who raises her own food, grows her own food, has, like a farm, and basically wasn't eating any of that food because it was on the, no-fly zone list, according to someone she had worked with. So she said, I would love to eat these vegetables and things that I'm growing on my land. Like, that's my dream. Like, that's why I'm doing it. I want to eat this food. So she started doing that, and actually like had no symptoms. Like, she felt fine doing it. So I think there can be a lot of inroads to this work. It kind of depends on where you're at, what, in what ways are you not listening to yourself, and in what ways are you experiencing symptoms, or, if it's gut stuff, I think it can be starting with food, like tuning in more on that intuitive level of, what do I really want to eat? What is my body asking for? Not in that like necessarily emotional way. And that's where it can get a little tricky, but what does my body really want? What is my body asking for? So that would be one way. Certainly doing, mindfulness type practices can be helpful. So like, there's body scan. I don't know if you've heard of, or if your listeners have heard of body scan type activities, but it's basically sitting and scanning from your feet up to your head and just checking in with each body part, just noticing what's present. It's amazing to me when I start this work with folks, how many people get emotional just from pausing for a minute and like, just, hey, how is my body feeling right now? How am I doing right now? What am I showing up with in this moment? Because we're just so unaccustomed to tuning into our bodies in that very simple way. So slowing down, doing a body scan, just like taking a moment to see how you're feeling, what you're doing, or how you're doing is kind of attunement 101. So when I work with folks, it starts with what I call the foundations of health. So that includes food, water, sleep, movement, and so those things need to be in place for, health to sort of blossom from, if that makes sense. It's a foundation. So like any foundation, it needs to be strong in order for someone to build on top of it. So, if a person's not eating any food, if they're not sleeping at nighttime, if they're dehydrated, those all need to be addressed. And those are all ways in which we are unattuned from ourselves if we're not taking care of them, if we're, chronically sleep deprived, which can be for many reasons. But if we're not listening to those cues of like, hey, I'm really tired, please go to bed, please put your phone down and, close your eyes, that can be one way that we're not listening to ourselves. So those are just some simple, inroads. Like I said, there are these simple foundational tweaks, but it's this idea of just starting to, I think of it as an inside out perspective versus an outside in perspective. So what does my body want? And then how do I then respond to it versus what is the world telling me or demanding of me? And then how do I respond to it? So it's this, I guess you could say like a paradigm shift or a perception shift of trying to feel inwardly first and then respond. So I guess it's nuanced and depends on the person, but those are just some thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And the more times people hear that intuitive eating or somatic work is an inside job, then I think the more that's going to land with them too. I was just speaking to Tracy Brown, an RD, a somatic experiencing RD too, and that phrase also came up. Like, it's an inside job. We have to give ourselves the space, and that doesn't mean that it's like a whole day off or anything like that. It's just like those moments of checking in give yourself that space to just say like, hey, body, what do you need right now?
Mm-hmm.
And the way you said, when you ask, have gone through body scans with folks, it really makes sense how that could be really emotional, because especially, and again, I'm thinking of my gals in midlife, in that for probably 20 plus years, nobody has asked them, hey, take a minute for yourself. What does it feel like in your body? And from a place of, don't give the correct answer. Don't think about giving the correct answer. Like, no, legit, what are you feeling?
Right.
And I think that's so foreign to so many women. And so just given that opportunity and encouragement to, hey, check in with yourself. What's going on with you today?
Yeah.
And no judgment, no shame, just check in.
Yeah.
Is such a beautiful, like you say, part of that foundation, which is so important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love what you just said too, which is a big important piece of that is every time we check in, it has to come, well, it doesn't have to, but it's ideally coming from a place of non-judgment, because this is not about, figuring out how to beat yourself up further or like figure out where you need to do more work or anything like that. It's just what is showing up for you right here, what right now, non-judgmentally, just from a place of curiosity and from a place of compassion. Ideally, it's, hi self, here I am, I'm checking in, I'm caring about you, I'm listening to you. What do you need? It's just like we would do with a child or a loved one. Like, what do you need? What do you need right now? I'm listening, you've got my attention. So that curiosity place is really important to shift into that mindset and not use it as more ground for beating yourself up.
Absolutely. Now, Erin, I'm so glad you're doing this work, and there are more and more practitioners we need doing this, deep dive into somatic experiencing work. So where can people learn more about you, the work, services that you're offering, learn more about this mind-body medicine experience? Where would you like to send people?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am rebranding. I just opened a practice that is solely focused on somatic work with folks. So my new business is called Aurora Somatic Medicine. So my website is aurorasomatic.com. So that's AURORA. Like Aurora Borealis. So aurorasomatic.com. And on there, you can read all about what I do. And my email is on there if anyone wants to send me an email. But the best way to get in touch if people are interested in working with me is to schedule a free consult. I offer free consults to just chat with folks and see where they're at, see what they're experiencing, and see if I can be of assistance to them. So that link is right there on my website as well.
Awesome. Great. We'll put links to that in the show notes so that people can find you, and highly recommend people just go and even do that discovery call just to kind of get a sense of what is this type of medicine and this modality, because it's so different than everything else that they're going to have exposed to, and also very complementary to what they might be doing too. I love how you said at the beginning, it's not either or, it's a nice complementary package.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks for being here. It's great to meet you, and we'll be in touch.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Amanda.